Welcome to LFPL's At the Library series, an ongoing podcast featuring author talks, programs, and events at the Louisville Free Public Library. For more information about upcoming events, visit us online at www.lfpl.org/upcoming events.
Tonight's class, or tonight's session, we're going to focus on spells, charms, and divination. In other words, it's witchcraft. When we think of magic in the Middle Ages, one of the figures that most immediately comes to mind is the figure of the witch. And the witch, well, on the first day of this class, I talked a bit about the way in which thinking about medieval magic often serves as a way of thinking about or casting an impression of the Middle Ages as somehow primitive or barbaric. And the figure of the witch is really the center of many of those beliefs. That is, not only do we think of witches themselves, that is, individual practitioners of magic, as perhaps wrapped up in superstition or pursuing some sort of misguided belief, or people who are so driven by their own sort of craziness that they don't really have a good, strong sense of the world. We either think of them that way, or we think about witchcraft persecutions, the sort of savage repression of witchcraft or those who are perceived to be witches. Indeed, when we think about when we use the phrase medieval witchcraft, the image that often comes to our mind is something like this, right? A torture chamber, right? A woman being tortured because, of course, and it is true that most witches, for reasons that we will discuss later, were often perceived to be women, though not unanimously. You've got some nasty people from the church over here. For some reason, there are spider frogs in this image. I have no idea why that's the case. But nonetheless, it's basically this sort of dungeon scene that then will lead inevitably to the poor witch being brought to a stake and burnt to death. One of the things we want to do today is try to dispel that impression. And the first way to dispel that impression is just to take a look quickly at a graph. This is a graph of witchcraft prosecutions in Europe between 1800 and 1300. And what's worth noticing, the Middle Ages here, 1300 to 1500 or so, there aren't that many prosecutions. All the prosecutions, or at least the vast majority of them, come during this period between roughly 1500 and 1700. And here you see there is a very noticeable spike. I suppose it's not really a spike, a stalactite. So we have to explain that stalactite, and we have to figure out, okay, if our impression of witchcraft during the Middle Ages is not necessarily accurate, what did it actually look like? So to start telling that story, the first thing I want to do is take you through a bit of a history of perceptions of witchcraft. And we'll start down here, circa 800 BC. The first really prominent witch for whom there's a name, at least in Western culture, is of course Circe from the Odyssey, the island dweller who used magic to turn Odysseus's men into various forms of animals that symbolically represented their own animal-like natures. Around 700 BCE, you have Exodus and the phrase, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live," one of the most famous phrases associated with Christian perceptions of witchcraft. Interestingly, it's not entirely clear that the Bible actually says that. The word that is used for witch here actually can be translated in multiple ways, including poisoners or potentially even practitioners of Egyptian religion. So we translate it as witch, and that's become more or less the conventional translation, but whether we understand that word in the same way as the people who wrote Exodus did is not 100% clear. In 383, we have the first Christian execution for witchcraft, and that's of a poor fellow named Priscillian of Avila. Interestingly, witchcraft here is couched as a form of heresy. So when we think about what is Priscillian being, what's the legal framework that's being used to prosecute Priscillian, witchcraft is a form of heretical magical practice. If you remember when we were talking about magic on the first day of this class, we said that when you think about not a monogamous religion, though we like those too, when you think about a monotheistic religion, early Christianity, early Judaism, it wasn't that only Christianity or only the Christian God had magic. It's that Christianity or Judaism had the monopoly on magic, even if it existed elsewhere in the cosmos. Around sometime between 668 and 690, we have the first English ban on witchcraft, which interestingly comes not in a legal text, but in a penitential of a fellow named Theodore of Tarsus. We're going to get back to him in a few minutes. 1233, we have the first laws determining what the proper mode of penalizing witchcraft is, at least in a formal legal framework. And here, they actually say not the death penalty, but conversion. So we both have this idea that witchcraft is somehow a survival of an old religion or a non-Christian religion, but also the idea, we're going to again return to in a few minutes, that witchcraft is not necessarily a capital offense. Witches don't actually start flying broomsticks until about 1280. And there's a little bit of lack of clarity about that. Anyway, we have images of witches straddling broomsticks, but it's actually not till the 15th century that we have the first really clear references to witches flying. So there's something going on there that we haven't quite sussed out. But at any rate, we can say if we want to push it back as early as possible, 1280. 1486. This is something we're going to talk about a lot today. The publication of one of the worst books in human history, the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, the book that became the textbook of witchcraft persecutions from the 15th century. Well, yes, 15th century forward, late 15th century forward. After the publication of the Malleus Maleficarum, it's only in 1542 that witchcraft comes to be seen as a felony. 1589, we start seeing the development of witches' familiars, so the idea that a witch might be associated with a black cat. So not until the 16th century. The height of witchcraft persecution, 1560 to 1630, so not even until we get really into the Renaissance and the Reformation. The 17th century, that's when witches come to be associated with pointy hats. It actually came out of an accusation that Quakers were practicing witchcraft, and Quaker women during this period often wore pointy hats. 1692, of course, the most famous, the Salem witchcraft trials. What's worth noting here, and this is the reason I put it on, not just because it's the one everybody knows, but you notice that it's so much later than everything else. Salem's a bit behind the curve, and we can actually explain that a bit again as we get further into the talk. Finally, 1939, witches get green skin because MGM wanted to showcase its new Technicolor technology for its film The Wizard of Oz. Before that, their skin was the same color as everybody else's. So, this gives us a sense, at least, how modern notions of witchcraft develop, or the modern associations we have with witchcraft. And as you see, they really mostly develop in the 15th century forward. Again, we're dealing with a post-medieval phenomenon when we think about our modern ideas of witchcraft. To try to get back at the medieval version of this, let's do a little etymology. So the word witch comes from the Proto-Indo-European root wyk, or vike, which comes down to us in the form of words that mean, or associated with the ideas of to choose, to separate, to bend, to turn, but also to consecrate or to ordain. So we have two different notions here, sort of combined in this root. On the one hand, the idea of manipulating things, whether we're talking about just sort of manipulating tools or manipulating reality, manipulating nature, but also the idea of holiness or the supernatural. That turns into the old High Germanic root Wiccona, which turns into Wicca and Wicca, which if we're going to do the proper Old English pronunciation, are actually witcha and witche for the male and the female. That's the Old English term for witch. It's the origin of our modern English term for witch. Interestingly, though, it's also the source of the word wigal, which is the Old English word for prophet. So if you're reading translations of the Bible into Old English, you don't necessarily see witches everywhere, but you do see wiggles. If we want to take this into modern languages, that root is the root of wizard, wicked, weak, victim, and victory. In Swedish, it gives us viga, which is the to wed, so again, that idea of consecrating a union. In Icelandic, vigja, to consecrate, so to ordain somebody a priest. In German, Weihnachten, Christmas, the holy night, or Wasser, again, holy water. So the idea of witchcraft, or the word witch, is not necessarily purely associated with the idea of malefaction, wrongdoing, or evil intent. It actually comes down to us as a holy word as well. It's not just a word for weakness, it's also a word for victory. Let's start seeing what people during the Middle Ages said about witchcraft. We're going to start with something that we saw all the way back on the first class. In the 6th century Penitential of Cummian, so this is an Irish text, we have, if any cleric or woman who practices magic misleads anyone by the magic, it is a monstrous sin, but a sin that can be expiated by penance. So here we have the explicit statement, witchcraft can be addressed not necessarily through execution, but really the proper way to address it is through penance. And in fact, that really makes sense if once we hit the 6th century, we're starting to see the idea of the supernatural being totally consolidated under the idea of God. If somebody says they're practicing witchcraft, it is here actually just a form of deceit. Jumping ahead a few hundred years, this is the Penitential of Theodore. This is our first English law relating to witchcraft. If a woman, it's not really a law, canon, church law, if a woman performs diabolical incantations or divinations, she shall do penance for 1 year or 3 40-day periods or 40 days, according to the nature of the offense. Of this matter, it is said in the canon, he who celebrates auguries, omens from birds or dreams, or any divinations according to the custom of the heathen, or introduces such people into his houses and seeking out any trick of the magicians, when these become penitents, if they belong to the clergy, they shall be cast out. Logically, you can't be both a witch and a priest, at least according to the church. But if they are secular persons, they shall do penance for 5 years. And penance here isn't very clearly defined. It doesn't necessarily mean that somebody is engaging in some sort of severe retribution towards the body or violence upon the body. It may simply be a matter of abstaining from alcohol or religiously attending church each week and not skipping it, or going on a trip to a local saint's shrine. So again, we have the idea that magic, or the practicing of magic, the act of a witch, is something that can be atoned for. It is not an unforgivable sin. Here we saw this one on the first day also. And it is right that every priest ardently preach the Christian faith and wholly eradicate every heathen practice. Here, the responsibility for dealing with witchcraft is clearly put onto the priest. This is a religious problem, and it has to be dealt with within the bounds of power, within the jurisdiction of a priestly authority, not necessarily legal authority. We don't actually see the first legal mention of a witch until the laws of Alfred the Great. And here, it actually only appears in his prologue, which is an Old English translation of Exodus. So here we have his version of those women who are accustomed to receive enchanters and magicians and witches, do not permit them to live. It's just an expanded version of the biblical text, couched in what is, more extensively, an Old English adaptation of the biblical text. There's no specific legal force attached to it. By the way, that film was made in 1971. It's horrible. The first real law that specifically addresses witchcraft comes in during the reign of Alfred's grandson, Ethelstan. And Ethelstan, in his second law code, concerning witchcraft, and we have pronounced concerning witchcraft and sorceries and secret attempts on life that, if anyone is killed by such, and he, the accused, cannot deny it, he is to forfeit his life. Notice here what is actually illegal. It's the use of magic to commit murder. It's not the use of magic itself. Now, at this point, I want to turn and actually start looking at some examples of witches and look at the way in which they're treated both in historical documents and in literary documents. But before we do that, I have to get something off my chest. This is not necessarily directly related to this talk, but it's something that bugs the hell out of every medievalist. And so we're going to talk about it. Often today, when people think about early medieval witchcraft, they think about runes, the mysterious language of the Druids, right? Carved on stones and sticks, the way in which they cast their spells over nature. Let me say this right now, there was absolutely nothing magical about runes. They were an alphabet. That's it. All of the runic inscriptions that survive basically look kind of like this one. This is from the Grinda runestone. Grjótjarðr and Eirithí, the sons, made this stone in memory of their able father, Guthver, who was in the West, and they divided up payment in England, essentially getting paid to not invade England. Manfully attacked townships in Saxony. They're memorial stones. They survive as markers of exploration. This is to commemorate the fact that I, such and such an explorer, made it this far into the wild. We actually don't have examples of people in the Middle Ages using runes to do special magical things. Even there's a wonderful cross in Scotland called the Rovell Cross. This has runes carved into the side of it. So first of all, they're clearly being used here for Christian purposes. And in fact, it's a poem about the crucifixion. So the next time you go into one of those New Age stores and they're like, here, take a rune stone, there is nothing magical about runes. I can now breathe again. All right, so let's actually take a look at some of the spells that were cast during this period, a couple of my favorites. For pain in the bowels and the fatty part of the abdomen, when you see a dung beetle on the ground throwing up earth, seize him and the heap he has made with both hands, kind of nasty, wave him vigorously with your hands and say the 3 times, remedium facio ad ventris dolorum. Basically, make a remedy for the sorrow or the pain of wind. Then throw away the beetle over your back, take care not to look after it. When a man's bowels or belly fat pain him, grasp his abdomen with your hands. He will soon be well. You will be able to do this for 12 months after seizing that beetle. Now, if a witch has put a curse on you, against a witch's spell, after fasting for a night, eat the root of a radish. On that day, the spell will not have any power to harm you. So if you put radishes in your salad, there's a good reason why. I quite like this one. For in cases in which one is having a difficult birth or delivery, let the woman who cannot bring forth her child take in her palm the milk of a cow of one color and sop it up with her mouth, and then go to running water and spit the milk therein, and with the same hand let her scoop up a mouthful of the water and swallow it, and let her then say these words, always have I carried with me this great strong hero. Through this famous food, a hero. Then I wish to have it and go home. When she goes to the brook, then let her not look around, nor yet when she goes thence, and let her thereafter go into a house other than the one from which she set out, and there let her take food. Now, what I particularly like about this practice is this idea of the unborn child as a hero. One of the things we've talked about several times so far in this class is the way in which magic really was fully integrated with Christian belief. so that when you look at many magic spells, there are explicit Christian concepts within them. Here, you don't have that sort of explicit Christian concept, but what you do have is an interesting survival of Germanic mythology. The idea that the baby is a hero. What kind of baby do you want to give birth to? Well, a strong, Beowulf-like baby. And that baby who will not leave the womb, that's not a sign that there's something wrong with the baby. That baby will just get out when that baby is good damn ready. It's a sign of his strength. For the stubbornness of fevers, take the same herb, which in this case marshwort, it's referring to a spell right before it, and dry it, then smoke the patient with it. It will drive away not only the fever, but also demonic possession, in case any of you were worried. Against snakebite, some advise us to pronounce one word, that is faul. I don't know what it means. Then it will not be able to damage him, the bite. For a bite made by a snake, if the sufferer procure and eat the rind, which comes from paradise, which is actually kind of plant here, no poison will injure him. Natural male enhancement and erectile dysfunction. If a man is sexually restrained by herbs, give him the caper plant to eat and let him drink holy water. Should a man be restrained, so another way of dealing with it, if he have Scottish wax and the slender betony on his person, or let him drink them in boiled ale, he cannot be restrained by herbs. The amount of time I spent trying to figure out Scottish wax. Scottish wax is, in fact, harder than other forms of wax. It's the kind of wax that's used to seal letters. So there is, in fact, some medieval Scotsman going around being like, your English wax is just weak. You need Scottish wax to get your John Thomas upstanding. I got no explanation for this one. I just stuck this in because I love it. For lunacy, if a man is demented, their language, take the skin of a porpoise, make it into a whip, flog the man with it, and he will soon be well. Amen. I'm pretty sure what that porpoise is thinking there right now is so long and thanks for all the fish. So those are just a couple of examples of surviving Old English spell work. Now, what's really interesting about them is they all survive in the same manuscript. It's a manuscript that's been designated by modern editors Lacnunga, which literally means remedies or medicines. And what's particularly significant about this is manuscript production during this period is totally dominated by the church, which means a religious foundation made the conscious decision to expend a great deal of resource, or very much resources, a lot of resources, there we go, and a great deal of effort in producing a manuscript that contained a mixture of natural and magical remedies. So again, we see this phenomenon in which Christianity and the supernatural are not separated. They are, in fact, both seen as components of one's life in nature. So let's meet a witch. This is one of the few references in Old English, or at least Old English historical documentation, to a magical practitioner. And it comes from a lawsuit from the late 10th century. This is what the charter reads. Here it is made known in this text that Bishop Ethelwold, he was the Bishop of Winchester, and Wulfstan Achea, he was just a guy, have exchanged properties with the knowledge of King Edward and his counselors. The bishop gave Wulfstan the property at Washington, and Wulfstan gave him the properties of Yaxley and at Aylesworth. Then the bishop gave the property at Yaxley to Thorney, and that at Aylesworth to Peterborough. Old English charters are thrilling. The land at Aylesworth had previously been confiscated from a widow and her son because they drove an iron nail into Alfsia, Wulfstan's father, and it was discovered. And that image, the word here is morth, was taken from her room. The word room here is really interesting. The Old English word here is incleopha. which not only can be translated as room, it also means lion's den. So we get a sense that there's a certain amount of intentional rhetoric behind this narrative. We're going to see more in a few minutes. Then the woman was taken out and they drowned her at London Bridge. Not at the bridge in London, a bridge on the road to London. But her son escaped and became an outlaw. The land then went to the king, who gave it to Elfsia, and his son Wulfstan later gave it to Bishop Ethelwold, just as is narrated above. Now, there are a couple of really interesting things about this charter. First of all, this is a charter that deals with lots of different properties, so you would think that the primary concern of this charter would be land exchange. Most of the lands are up there. The entire second half of the charter is all dedicated to this narrative about one person who owned just one of those properties. So one thing we can say right off the bat, this is a document that was produced not necessarily just to record these land exchanges, but really because there's a reason they wanted to tell this story. And so the question is, why did they want to tell this story? Well, the land at Ellsworth had previously been confiscated from a widow and her son. This is really interesting. By referring to the woman as a widow, we accomplish a couple of things. First of all, she has no name. So she and her ownership of this land are erased from the legal record. No one can go back and say, oh, that was the land owned by so-and-so, therefore they have a rightful claim to it. Now she's been taken out entirely. By referring to her as just as a widow, the text conveys the impression of essentially a sort of old woman living on the margins of the community, basically poor, right? The way in which we tend to think about witches during this period. We know this land from Doomsday Book. This is a large property. This was, in fact, somebody who was wealthy and prominent in the community, whatever her name may have been. The rhetoric of the text is designed to make her seem more marginal. The accusation here is that she drove an iron nail or an iron pin into Alfsia, Wulfstan's father, and it was discovered, and that image was taken from her room. We already said room here is associated with the idea of the lion's den, so in her secret place. That image, this is one of the earliest, if not the earliest English example of image magic, what we would now call, somewhat problematically, a voodoo doll. So essentially, the accusation isn't that she did anything to this person, Alfsia. It's that, oh, we found this thing in her room, which is very convenient. Then the woman was taken out and drowned at London Bridge. One of the things I find most interesting about this charter is the language of revelation and concealment. Here it is made known. We're going to reveal this story. We have to reveal what was in the witch's room. Then we have to submerge her at London Bridge, make sure she doesn't come back. There is no evidence of drowning being used to penalize witchcraft at this early stage. We've already seen that witchcraft was not a capital offense. This is highly irregular. Of course, it does connect with the idea that water has, in some sense, some power to hinder or obstruct magic. We already saw in the first lecture King Ethelbert making sure the Christian missionaries stayed on the other side of on an island, on the other side of a river, to make sure that their magic couldn't cross into his kingdom. Of course, later in the Middle Ages, we'll have the idea of the water test for a witch. And there's the most famous association of a witch with water, the great Margaret Hamilton. I should also say, as I was preparing this lecture, I ran across this image. I don't know what to make of it. I just saw it, and I was like, I have to put this in. I was trying to think of a funny caption, and it speaks for itself. I don't know what to say about it. At any rate, getting back to the charter. But her son escaped and became an outlaw. This is the most important sentence in this charter. The woman's gone, the name of the family is erased, and the son is now an outlaw. He does not have any rights or protections under the law. which means he has no way of trying to regain his family land. And just to make sure of all of this, it makes sure to tell us Bishop Ethelwold and Wulfstan Uchea have exchanged properties with the knowledge of the king and his counselors, and that the land, at one point in the exchange, went to the king. This entire text is designed to produce a specific response from its readers, and it's a response of obedience. Yes, this is a weird story with all sorts of inconsistencies, all sorts of irregularities. But by emphasizing this all took place with the knowledge of the king, with the knowledge of his counselors, with the knowledge of the church, that the king himself actually received the land at one point, you as the reader of this charter are then put into the position of having to say, oh, well, I think there's something wrong with the king. Oh, I think there's something wrong with the church. Are you, as a good subject of the king, really going to do that? Because it does not end well. So here we see this idea of witchcraft being used in a legal context, essentially to justify a really problematic land grab. Let's take a look at another witch now. We're going to jump ahead about, 200 years or so, and we're going to return to the work of William of Malmesbury. And he tells a story, or he records in his History of England, the tale of the Witch of Berkeley, not to be confused. And his story goes like this. There resided at Berkeley a woman addicted to witchcraft, as it afterward appeared. And notice that idea of addicted. And skilled in ancient augury, she was excessively gluttonous, perfectly lascivious, setting no bounds to her debaucheries, as she was not old, though fast declining in life. So her evilness, her practice of witchcraft has prematurely aged her. On a certain day, a jackdaw chattered a little more loudly than usual, on hearing which the woman's knife fell from her hand, her countenance grew pale, and deeply groaning, she says, "This day my plow has completed its last furrow. Today I shall hear of and suffer some dreadful calamity." She goes on to return home, and she gives her sons a commission. She says to them, "Now, since I have approached the end of my life, I entreat you by your mother's breasts to endeavor to alleviate my torments, and, though you cannot revoke the sentence already passed on my soul, you may perhaps rescue my body. Sew up my corpse in the skin of a stag, lay it on its back in a stone coffin, fasten down the lid with lead and iron. On this day lay a stone bound round with 3 iron chains of enormous weight. Put that on top of everything. Let there be psalms sung for 50 nights and masses said for an equal number of days to allay the ferocious attacks of my adversaries. If I lie thus secure for 3 nights, on the 4th day, bury your mother in the ground. Although I fear lest the earth, which has been so often burdened with my crimes, should refuse to receive me." Now, there's something really interesting here that we're actually going to come back to next class when we talk about the dark arts, especially necromancy and the raising of the dead. And that is this bit here. Sew up my corpse in the skin of the stag and lay it on its back in a stone coffin. We actually have archaeological evidence that this was a real practice. And we are going to look at some graves next time in which we see how this works and discuss what it might have meant. They did their utmost to comply with her injunctions, but alas, in vain were their pious tears, for on the first 2 nights, while the choir of priests was singing, the devils, one by one, with the utmost ease, bursting open the door of the church, broke asunder the 2 outer chains, the middle one being more laboriously wrought, remained entire. But on the 3rd night, about cockcrow, the whole monastery seemed to be overthrown from its very foundation by the clamor of the approaching enemy. One devil, more terrible in appearance than the rest, and of loftier stature, broke the gates to shivers by the violence of his attack. The priests grew motionless with fear, their hair stood on end, and they became speechless. You see why people love William of Malmesbury so much. He proceeded with haughty step towards the coffin, calling upon the woman by name, and he commanded her to rise. She, replying that she could not on account of her chains, he said, "You shall be loosed." And directly he broke the chain, which had mocked the ferocity of the others with as little exertion as if it had been made of flax. He also beat down the cover of the coffin with his foot, and taking her by the hand before them all, he dragged her out of the church. At the doors appeared a black horse, proudly neighing, with iron hooks projecting over his whole back, on which this wretched creature was placed. Immediately, with the whole party, vanished from the eyes of the beholders. Her pitiable cries, however, for assistance were heard for nearly the space of 4 miles. Now, there are a couple of things to say about this story. First thing is, this is a great story. I mean, this is just a terrific narration. And as I said a minute ago, it really tells you what a great author William of Malmesbury is and how much fun it is to read his history. But it also tells us a couple of other things. The first important thing to note about this text is that the witch, upon realizing that she's going to die, has already given up hope for her soul. The focus here is on her body. And this tells us something really important. One of the great fears in the Middle Ages, one of the great anxieties, is the idea of the body that doesn't stay dead. And as I said, this is an idea we are going to return to. But here, the concern is, what happens if my body comes back? Her soul will already have been gone. So the implication is the body will actually be possessed by some sort of demon, and it will come back to plague the community. So this is one thing it tells us. It also tells us something else. Note that in this account of this woman, there is no generalizing language. That is, one of the ways in which we talk about witchcraft is as a vehicle for medieval misogyny. And Lord knows it is. There is no way to dismiss the sheer saturation of misogyny in this society. Not that these days we are much better, but nonetheless, here, the focus of the narrative is, this is a story about this one person, not a category of people. She is distinct and unique. And the narrative here really functions less as a statement about witchcraft than it does as a small morality tale, right? Oh, you practice the wrong kind of magic, you have the wrong kind of beliefs, you are a little bit heterodox, you are verging on heresy maybe in your thoughts, it will prematurely age you, it will cause nasty things to happen to your corpse, and it means that demons and devils will come and take you away. The idea here is not that we look at this and say, oh God, witches are all around us. The idea is that we look at this and say, oh, this is what proper or improper behavior looks like. In that sense, very similar to the Charter. The narrative of the witch is used as a way of dictating what the norms of behavior should be for a good subject in society. So both these tales are from the first one's from the early Middle Ages. William of Malmesbury, writing in the 12th century, that's the High Middle Ages. Let's jump ahead about 400 years. And we're going to jump ahead to the trial of a woman named Mary Smith in King's Lynn in 1616. Mary very much fulfills the stereotype of the witch. She is a woman who was supremely disliked by her neighbors. She appears to have been actually of really unpleasant temperament. She was seen as somebody who, if you came into contact with her, bad things would happen. She is therefore arrested, in this case, in fact, by the famous witch finder general, appointed by King James I, who considered himself an expert on witches. He actually wrote a whole book about it, and Shakespeare, to flatter him, wrote a play about it called Macbeth. She's arrested, she's tried, and she's executed. And what is really interesting here is the document recording her execution records it twice. And the language used is really interesting. Here's one version. So she's brought out to the place of execution. For the wrongs done to them, she craved mercy at God's hands, and for all her other sins, and in particular for that of witchcraft. She renounced the devil, embraced the mercies of God, purchased by the obedience of Jesus Christ, and professed that her hope was only by his suffering and passion to be saved. And all of this, she in particular manner confessed openly at the place of execution in the audience of multitudes of people gathered together, as is usual at such times, to be beholders of her death. And being asked if she would be contented to have a psalm sung, answered willingly that she desired the same, and chose it herself, the lamentation of a sinner whose beginning is, Lord, turn not away thy face, and after the ending thereof thus finished her life. So that, in the judgment of charity, we are to conceive the best, and think she resteth in peace, notwithstanding her heinous transgressions formerly committed, for there is no malady incurable to the Almighty. So we have a very particular depiction of witchcraft here. It's being portrayed as a malady, right? It's a sickness, which raises questions again about what degree of intentionality is involved. She has been framed here in the form of a morality tale. Her execution is a piece of theater. She's brought forward. She voluntarily, of her own free will, announces, these are what my sins have been. I repent. She wants a psalm sung. She shows to the people the grace of God. And this is one of the purposes of witches among us. Sinners reveal the infinity of God's grace. So that's one version of her execution. Here, her execution practically doesn't even happen. Thus ended her life. But he has another tale of the execution in another part of the text. This is how he describes it there. And of these, in the crime, in the day of execution, which she no wise would condescend should be deferred, though offered, reprieve upon hope that more might have been acknowledged, being very distemperate. She apparently did not enjoy being executed. She was very grumpy about the whole thing. Nevertheless, some accompanied her to the place, and were both eye and ear witnesses of her behavior there, seeing and hearing how she did then particularly confess her confederacy with the devil, cursing, banning, and envy towards her neighbors, and hurts done to them, expressing everyone by name, so many as to be in the following discourse nominated, and how she craved the mercy of God and pardon for her offense. Here we get a very different picture of Mary Smith. Now, the idea of this woman coming forward to reveal her sins and accept her execution as a form of penance, as a symbol of the infinite grace of God. She will die in the body, but live in the soul. Here, it's replaced by, frankly, a rather disturbing depiction of an angry and terrified woman being dragged to her place of execution, tortured until she basically curses everybody around her, and then finally, thank God, is put out of the community. She is executed, and now we good people of King's Lynn no longer have to worry about this cursed woman wandering around plaguing our community anymore. What you might say is what we have here are two different visions of the witch in the early 17th century. One vision preserves this idea of the narrative of witchcraft as a form of moral improvement. The other one tracks witchcraft as a form of, or as a version of, this is what's wrong with women and outsiders, right? This is how awful and disgusting they are. This is the kind of threat they pose to the community. This is why they should be executed. And when they are brought to the place of execution, there's no nobility, there's no sense of salvation. They're clawing, kicking, and cursing the whole way. They deserve what was done to them. So now we have three different witches. We have our two medieval witches, the Witch of Berkeley and the witch in that problematic charter. And now we have this early 17th century witch, a very different kind of narrative. There's an emphasis on a crowd here. There was no talk about a crowd in either of the previous narratives. Neither of those witches died as a form of public theater. There's an emphasis on the witch's just general horribleness as a human being that is something that is innate to her, that is connected to the idea of her being an awful outcast woman. The question we have to answer is between earlier narratives of witchcraft, in which the witch is seen as a discrete individual, earlier narratives of magic, in which magic is integrated in Christian practice, and this later 17th century version, at the height of the witchcraft persecutions, we have to answer the question, what changed? What circumstance, what historical shift caused the movement from the medieval version of witchcraft and the medieval response to witchcraft, thinking back to that graph, where witchcraft trials were actually a rare and unusual thing, to the 17th century, where witchcraft trials have become common and very much an example of society's hatred of women. The first thing that happened is the publication of the Malleus Maleficarum. As I said at the beginning of this talk, this is one of the most awful books in history. Naturally, it was a bestseller. This book was tremendously popular when it was released. The title translates to The Hammer of Witches, which, to be fair, is a great title. And it's bought and read and translated throughout Europe. So this is a book everybody is reading. Everybody's being influenced by. This has become one of the lenses through which, in the late 15th century, we start to see magical practice. And how does it describe magical practice? Well, women, am I right? All witchcraft comes from carnal lust, which is in women insatiable. Wherefore, for the sake of fulfilling their lusts, they consort even with devils. More such reasons could be brought forward, but to the understanding it is sufficiently clear that it is no matter for wonder that there are more women than men found infected with the heresy of witchcraft. And in consequence of this, it is better called the heresy of witches than of wizards, since the name is taken from the more powerful party, and blessed be to the highest, who has so far preserved the male sex from so great a crime. So what are the reasons that women are so given to witchcraft? Well, the first reason is they're more credulous. And since the chief aim of the devils is to corrupt faith, he attacks them especially. The second reason is that women are naturally more impressionable and thus more ready to receive the influence of a disembodied spirit. The third reason is they have slippery tongues and are unable to conceal from their fellow women those things which they know through their evil arts. It's the great female conspiracy. Since they are feebler both in mind and body, it is not surprising that they should come under the spell of witchcraft. For as regards intellect, the understanding of spiritual things, they seem to be of a different nature than men. But the natural reason is she is more carnal than a man, as is clear from her many abominations. And it should be noted that there was a defection in the formation of the first woman, since she was formed from a bent rib, that is, a rib of the breast that was bent, as it were, in a contrary direction to man. I spent a lot of time trying to figure out the anatomy of that, didn't get anywhere. And since, through this defect, she is an imperfect animal, she always deceives. This is language right out of a modern incel blog. It has the same spite. It has the same combination of both desire and repulsion. It is the same tendency to impose upon, in this case, the entire female sex, certain qualities that make them necessarily inferior, and more than that, dangerous to men. Because, as Heinrich Kramer, the author of the Maleficarum, will tell us, these witches practice a very particular kind of malefaction upon humanity. And what then is to be thought of those witches who, in this way, sometimes collect male organs in great numbers? Yes, witches go out and steal men's penises. And by the way, that is an image from a manuscript of a penis tree. I love manuscripts. So yes, they sometimes we collect male organs in great numbers, as many as 20 or 30 members together, and put them in a bird's nest or shut them up in a box. This is the sort of thing people are reading. Where they move themselves like living members and eat oats and corn, as has been seen by many and is a matter of common report. It is to be said that it is all done by the devil's work and illusion, for the senses by those who see them are deluded in the way we have said. For a certain man tells that when he had lost his member, he approached a known witch to ask her to restore it to him. She told the afflicted man to climb a certain tree, and then he might take whichever penis he found there out of the nest, which there were several. And when he tried to take a big one, the witch said, "You must not take that one," adding, "because it belongs to a parish priest." It's an entertaining story, but the idea that women's sexual capacity in some sense vitiates, demasculinizes men, a common trope in much modern misogynist internet discourse, we see it alive and well in this book. Believe it or not, it gets worse. Because once you hear about all of the horrible things witches have done, you have to have a proper way to extract information from them. And the best way to do that is, of course, torture. The method of beginning an examination by torture is as follows. First, the jailers prepare the implements of torture, then they strip the prisoner, if it be a woman. She has already been stripped by other women of upright and good report. This stripping is lest some means of witchcraft may have been sewed into the clothing, such as often taught by the devil, they prepare from the bodies of unbaptized infants, murdered that they might forfeit their salvation. So they have the ground up unbaptized infants hiding in their pockets or something. And when the implements of torture have been prepared, the judge, both in person and through other good men zealous in the faith, tries to persuade the prisoner to confess the truth freely. But if he will not confess, he bids attendants make the prisoner fast to the strapado or some other implement of torture. The attendants obey forthwith, yet with feigned agitation. Then, at the prayer of some of those present, the prisoner is loosed again and is taken aside and once more persuaded to confess, being led to believe that he will in that case not be put to death. This is not just about the physical consequences of torture, this is also about the use of psychological torture. And if you think back a few minutes to the trial and execution of Mary Smith, you remember it said that she had the opportunity to delay her execution, and they tried to encourage her to do so in hopes that they could get more information out of her. Exactly the sort of process that's being described here. The Malleus Maleficarum, as I said, is the textbook for witchcraft persecutions. It is a disgusting, hateful book, and as much as we can laugh at some of the really bizarre elements, it's a book that had tremendous negative consequences. But why would it become a bestseller? What happened to make this book that popular and influential? I think there are two things we can point to. The first, again, looking at a graph of witchcraft persecutions, we're right here with the publication of the Malleus Maleficarum right at the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. And we move through the Catholic Counter-Reformation. This is not to say that the Protestant Reformation was in some sense responsible for witchcraft persecutions. It is to say that this is a period of profound supernatural disruption. This is a moment when people's beliefs are challenged. Their sense of what it means to be saved, to go to heaven, is under threat. The question comes up, my parents, before Martin Luther said anything, they lived and died good Catholics. Did they perhaps not go to heaven because they obeyed this papist king in Rome? So you have real anxiety at, you might say, the metaphysical level. People are anxious for their souls. But there's also a material reason. This is a graph of inflation from the Middle Ages through the early modern period and take a look at where inflation really starts to rapidly increase, right there at the end of the 15th and beginning of the 16th centuries. So not only are we looking at a period of religious rupture, we're also looking at a period of economic insecurity. So if we want to try to figure out how did people think about witchcraft and why or how did it evolve into the sorts of associations we have today, in fact, we have a couple of good solid reasons or good solid things to point to. It is no surprise to say that anxiety about the supernatural, bias, and superstition all increase in periods of cultural and economic upheaval. The witchcraft persecutions are very much a response to the historical circumstances of the period in which they took place. Fortunately, a great deal has changed since then. Next week, for our final class, we will be turning, we talked about witchcraft, to defense against the dark arts. Thank you all very much. And if anybody has any questions. Yes?
Was there any difference between the way that Protestant countries and Catholic countries dealt with witches after the Protestant Reformation?
No.
So it was pretty equal?
It was pretty equal across the board. And in part, that's because when you think about where witchcraft persecutions are taking place, they're in the cities, but they're mostly in sort of mid-range towns and villages. So we're not talking about places that are necessarily close to the center of power, though there's certainly plenty of witchcraft trials and executions there too. But for many people, these aren't the people who are central to the great religious debates between Luther and the church about predestination and salvation and the other various questions, indulgences and the like. These are people who are basically trying to live their lives. And the supernatural has always been a central part of their life. And that doesn't change when countries switch from Catholic to Protestant or in the Counter-Reformation back again. Yeah.
So I guess you're saying that they were scapegoating women essentially because of the religious and economic upheaval. Was there, like, individually speaking, a reason why they chose certain women? Like an intellectual?
This is actually a harder question to answer than you might think. Oh, sorry. Why were certain women chosen to be tried and executed as witches? The answer that's often given is that it's essentially women who are particularly vulnerable, right? Women who can be extracted from society and on whom the troubles of society can be blamed. The problem is that actually does not necessarily reflect the group of people or the population of people who are tried and executed as witches. There are certainly many women like that. But many of these women are also wives of middle-class merchants, aristocrats, women from all different sets of society. Often the motivation simply seems to be, who isn't liked as much? Who's the least popular one in the group? Who can be blamed? Or even something as simple as, yeah, I was hanging out with this person last weekend, and when I came home, my husband fell ill with the plague. It was probably her. So it really often was just as little as the coinciding of an interaction and a negative event. Yeah.
Where did witches come from? I mean, were you born a witch? Grew up to be a witch?
There is a lot of debate on this during the 17th century. One of the ways in which you find a witch, of course, is to determine whether she has witches' marks on her, which are essentially birthmarks, moles, anything that might actually naturally occur on somebody's skin. And so the implication is that there is something naturally witch-like about women. But predominantly, witchcraft is a choice. And the women who commit acts of witchcraft, we condemn them because they had every chance to be virtuous members of society, but they chose not to be. Against all logic, they preferred the devil to the world. And so part of the justification for an execution is not just we're eliminating this person from society, but the body must pay the penalty for the salvation of the soul. So there is still the potential for these women's souls to be saved, but the body has to be destroyed first. We are doing this out of charity. Other questions? Yes?
When you were speaking of being penitential for having practiced witchcraft back in the 6th century, the text specifically said it was a horrendous or heinous sin if you tricked someone through witchcraft. Does that imply that if people knew about someone being a witch, but no one was unhappy with their actions, then nothing was needed to be done?
I think it's not necessarily that. I think the question is, why did the penitential from the 6th century, the penitential of Comines, specifically say if you used witchcraft as a form of deceit? And I think actually what's being referenced there is the coincidence of witchcraft and heresy. So the person being targeted is not necessarily the person who is using, say, some of the different spells or herbal practices that I described. It's the person who perhaps is still clinging to their pre-Christian beliefs, or attempting to convert others to those beliefs, proselytizing with those beliefs, or claiming that those beliefs have a meaningful impact on the world. So I think that's really the person who they're worried about, because of course, because those beliefs are false, that kind of witchcraft has to be a form of deceit. Other question? Yes?
So the author for this Malleus Maleficarum, was this someone fairly well educated? What was the background?
Heinrich Kramer? He was a scholar, not a particularly well-known one. This is the work which really made his career. Remember, as we said in the first class, witchcraft was not just a matter of regional practice or local practice, it was also a matter of intellectual study. As we move into the Renaissance, one of the great lines about the Renaissance is, of course, this is the birth of modern science. Part of what motivates people like Kramer and others who write similar books, they're providing a scientific study of witchcraft, right? How can we actually understand this phenomenon? As we look around this world and try to bring some intellectual order to it, what are its causes? How can we report on them to society so that society can better respond to them? So in that sense, the Malleus Maleficarum is very much a scholarly project. Sold a whole lot more than any of my books ever did. Other questions? Yeah.
During that peak era of witch persecution, was there a lot of other religious motivated persecution going on, or was it primarily religious?
No. You're in the period right at this point in the run-up to the 30 Years' War. So Protestants are persecuting Catholics, Catholics are persecuting Protestants, everybody is persecuting Jews. This is a period when persecution thrives. And we actually make a mistake when we see witchcraft persecution as some sort of distinct phenomenon. It's taking place right at the same time as what has been called in the scholarly literature a persecuting society is taking formation. Yes?
So I'm thinking that the Spanish Inquisition happened before the Malleus Maleficarum was written.
Right at the same time.
And part of the weeding out the Cathars and stuff in France.
That's earlier.
So how did the alchemists escape getting burned at the stake? Because Alchemy is like consorting with demons for Queen Elizabeth.
Of course, and next time we're going to talk about Johann Faust. The alchemists, first of all, remember, were not necessarily practicing magic, right? They were practicing a form of science. So they weren't necessarily seen as engaging in the kind of supernatural practices. But I think really, there just weren't as many of them, right? When you look at, say, witches, you can say, here we have an entire female population. Alchemists, you have a couple of scholars at your various universities, all of whom are speaking in strange, abstruse ways to one another. Honestly, what the people say at universities when they're using their technical jargon, nobody really cares. So I think that's part of it too. But we do see people being accused of alchemy as witches and alchemists being accused of witchcraft. So there is overlap, but you don't see the kind of full-on persecution that you see elsewhere, and that's probably the reason why. Other questions?
Another question.
Yes?
What caused the drop in the persecution?
The question is, why did witchcraft persecution more or less cease? I don't actually have a good answer for that. Certainly at a certain point, religious divisions start to solidify and the religious identities of certain communities start to become more firmly established. You also do see, and even actually starting back in the High Middle Ages, texts being produced that object to witchcraft prosecutions, that object to the assignation of witchcraft to specifically women. And so you do see a growing preponderance of texts being produced that are challenging or questioning the view of witchcraft present in the Malleus Maleficarum. You also have the widespread recognition that many of those practicing these persecutions are not themselves morally blameless. And the great example of that is Matthew Hopkins, the great witch finder, the fellow who is appointed specifically to root out witches in England. So the guy goes from town to town, basically pointing at women and saying, the women of your town are evil and you should burn them. You can probably imagine how well that worked out for Matthew Hopkins in the end, right? Eventually, he himself is accused of criminal practices, arrested, tried, and sent off. So the idea that witchcraft prosecution has become so prevalent and so common that we can no longer accept the belief that it has some sort of positive effect on our crops or our community. I think that's probably one of the big reasons that it starts to decline.
More science, real science, and rationalism.
The comment is perhaps more science and rationalism. I tend to be really suspicious of this, that sort of the narrative of more science and rationalism, in part because these prosecutions are taking place right at the moment when we're moving into the Renaissance and, the Enlightenment. I mean, if you think about, the year 1692, that coincides with the work of many of the thinkers who will become, definitively influential on, say, the founders of the United States and the Declaration of Independence. So it's not that we move from a period of superstition to a period of science. They're taking place right at the same time. And one does not necessarily exclude or obviate the other. Yes, question in the back.
So along those lines, if the unexplained phenomenon is negative and that's associated with witchcraft, is the opposite, so when it's positive, attributed to religion or God or men, right, there are miracles that is, or something that is it viewed kind of in that way as the negative, positive, negative, and that just kind of that kind of very basic way?
So the question is, What if that negative event that might cause somebody to be labeled a witch, what if we flip that paradigm and say it's a positive event? How is that understood? It's very much a blessing from God. And remember also, we talk about witches as sort of practitioners of magic. Remember, there are also members of society who are designated practitioners of magic. There's your priest, who carries out transubstantiation, and even more importantly, there are the saints in your local church, particularly in Catholic countries, where they are the positive influences on society, right? You want somebody to get healed, you go to your local saint and ask them to, we wouldn't call it magic, but bless you so that there's some sort of positive outcome. So yeah, bad events, probably the witches. Good events, God. Other questions? Folks, it's been great to talk to you this evening. I look forward to seeing you next week.